Hi everyone, welcome back. Today I want to talk about something which is really important, and it's just not getting the coverage it needs because it's a massive threat to our democracy and to our sovereignty. And it's called, and it is a catchy title, it's called the Transatlantic Trade Investment Partnership. That's a bit of a mouthful, so let's just call it TTIP.
It's not a great name. Maybe they should find another one, because this week deep divisions emerged in the European Parliament over the EU's planned trade deal with the US. The European Parliament's president, he's called Martin Schulz, decided to postpone a vote on the trade negotiations. Then MEPs voted to postpone a debate on the issue. So what's all the fuss about?
This is something enormous. It is about a final control. And it's the United States saying there may be another power in the world, but we will be the ultimate power.
The TTIP is the most important thing that is happening in Europe right now. It's a secretive deal being negotiated between Europe and the United States.
And TTIP, if you haven't heard about it, is being negotiated largely in secret between the European Union and the United States. And what it's going to do is it's going to give big businesses the same rights as nation states and allow them to sue elected governments in secret courts if they implement policies that in some way affect their profits.
Protesters up in arms over plans for a free trade agreement between the EU and the US outside the European Parliament this week. It's also fiercely divided opinion amongst MEPs inside the building, and tempers frayed when a vote and debate on TTIP, scheduled for Wednesday, were cancelled at the 11th hour.
To decide to delay the vote is, to our delegation anyway, a big problem in terms of how it's perceived by the citizens of Europe.
We've spent weeks preparing for this week's debate and vote.
Millions of people are waiting to hear what we're going to do today. And you're simply sweeping this aside.
Given
the lack of agreement between the groups, not just the majority groups but the lack of agreement between all the groups in the resolution, President Schulz quite wisely decided to postpone the vote.
What is this European Parliament where the President decides to manipulate the rules because he's afraid of not getting a majority on this?
So if there are 40 members in this House willing to stand up now, we can force a vote on whether to stop the plenary completely.
Sit down, please.
These scenes follow months of horse trading between different political groups in the Parliament when the key players thought they'd reached agreement.
Once signed, it will cement a key part of the US government's plan to create a new global bloc that will ensure the dominance of its largest companies. And to understand why, we need to go back to the 1950s.
See the USA in your Chevrolet. America's asking you to call. Drive your Chevrolet through the USA.
After the Second World War, the United States accounted for half of the world's economy. Its influence was unmatched by any country, and it was able to write the early rules of international trade to its advantage. The World Trade Organization was created in this context, and the US dictated rules that favoured American business. But as economies like China and India joined the WTO, it became a more democratised arena, and the US found it harder to control its decision-making.
At the WTO, at its Doha rounds, India spoke up and Brazil spoke up, and the US lost control.
I think it's no use beating around the bush. This meeting has collapsed.
The US felt it needed a new strategy to maintain its global dominance. So in the classical American style, they went big. To bypass the WTO, they're creating the biggest international agreements that the world has ever seen. They're called the three big T's. The Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, or TTIP, and the Trade in Services Agreement, or TISA. And they're all being negotiated in secret right now.
So I'll give you an example. Take Australia. Now what they try to do is introduce plain cigarette packaging. It's to try and protect the safety, the health of consumers by trying to deter people from smoking. But Philip Morris, a massive tobacco giant, they used a similar treaty to sue the Australian government.
It's got to be some sort of joke.
What TTIP aims to do as well is standardise the regulations on both sides of the Atlantic. Now, these are regulations that protect our health, protect the environment and so on, but the problem is, over in the US, regulations are far laxer when it comes to hormones, which have been linked to cancer, pesticides and genetically modified foods. But what TTIP would mean is a race to the bottom, encouraging the EU to go down to the same level as the United States.
And then the chamber was empty and remained so for most of the morning. The MEP's Trade Committee now has 200 or so amendments to consider, and a vote on this controversial issue looks highly unlikely in this place before September. The real sticking point here is over the highly charged issue of investor protection, a system known as the Investor State Dispute Settlement Mechanism, or ISDS. It's a private arbitration system which allows companies in one country to sue governments in another country if an investment runs into problems.
Perhaps they were useful 20 years ago, but in a modern society where democratic parliaments decide on the necessary developments in society, I think there's no legitimation to give foreign investors more rights than domestic investors.
We only found out when WikiLeaks was able to leak parts of them.
And what's interesting is when you look across all of these deals, whether it be TTIP, TPP or TISA, China is excluded, but also Brazil, Russia, India, South Africa, they're all excluded because those are the emerging economies.
What is not often understood is that these agreements are part of a geopolitical war. This is a new war which is taking place between the United States and China. The United States is very scared of the rise of China, so it has moved to militarily encircle it through what is called the pivot to Asia, and now it's moving on to doing that economically.
The basic idea which comes across from reading US strategy papers is the construction of a new grand enclosure. And to put inside this grand enclosure, the United States, 51 other countries, 1.6 billion people, and 2/3 of global GDP. To integrate Latin America away from Brazil and towards the United States, to integrate Southeast Asia away from China and towards the United States, and to integrate Western Europe, pulling it away from Eurasia as a whole and towards the Atlantic.
According to every poll going, the vast majority of people in this country want a publicly run national health service. They want utilities and services to be run by the public sector, not by profiteers. But TTIP would mean that it would be very, very hard to return privatised services back where they should be under the accountable control of the public. One of the things that's so dodgy about this treaty is it's been negotiated behind closed doors, so we can't actually scrutinise what's really going on and what's being planned. But when the European Commission was forced to reveal who they'd be meeting in the build-up to drawing up this treaty, overwhelmingly, over 90% of those meetings were with large corporations with private interests. Now, we hear a lot about threats to our sovereignty, to our democracy from the Tories, from the right-wing media.
I think we need to bust some of the myths.
But TTIP exposes how shamelessly hypocritical and disingenuous they really are. So take a few years ago when David Cameron vetoed the EU treaty, saying it was standing up for the national interest to do so. But he wasn't really standing up for the national interest there, unless you think the financial sector and the national interest are completely synonymous. I happen to disagree. But David Cameron is one of the biggest cheerleaders there is for TTIP.
Supporters of TTIP say it'll open up new markets in both the US and Europe. EU-based companies would be able to sell their products in America without paying prohibitively high tariffs, expand their businesses and compete more effectively in a globalised world. Critics claim democracy is being traded away.
companies might sue states if they change their laws, for example, when it comes to energy. Now we have a case in Germany where a Swedish company is suing the state of Germany because the parliament decided to phase out nuclear power. So in that sense, it is a danger to public lawmaking.
Either way, TTIP is a big deal for Europe. Postponing the vote by MEPs isn't a deal breaker at this point in the negotiations, but their approval will be necessary for the final trade pact to go ahead.
When signed, TTIP will cover half of global GDP and will affect every European member state. Yet EU parliamentarians have serious restrictions in accessing the proposed agreement.
Yeah, I find it incredible as well that for something which is a trade agreement, not a matter of life and death in terms of security, where maybe you can understand some restrictions, and we don't even like those very much, but for a trade agreement, you know, that we can't actually make notes about what it is we're reading, issues that we might want to take away to look into, which actually might reassure us, you know, if we really were able to sort of take this away and look at it in depth.
We don't have access to the key documents, the most important ones, because the devil is in the detail. When it comes to trade agreements, you need to know exactly what's in the text so that you can assess what the impact's going to be.
If EU parliamentarians want to see the TTIP, they have to call the US Embassy and make an appointment. The appointments are only available 2 days a week for 2-hour time slots. Only 2 parliamentarians are permitted at once. They go to the US Embassy, they have to hand in every electronic device, so they cannot possibly make a copy. They must agree to keep everything confidential, and then they're led to a secure reading room where 2 US Embassy guards watch everything that they do. How can EU parliamentarians possibly understand what they're negotiating for Europe under these circumstances?
Now, all the people cheerleading TTIP on, they're saying that there'll be huge economic benefits for people here in Britain and across the European Union. But there's also a report commissioned by the British government, and it said of the part of the treaty that allows corporations to sue elected governments in secret courts, that there was likely to have few or no benefits to the UK while having meaningful economic and political costs.
What is the thing that causes you most concern?
Well, I would say there are 3 big concerns. The first is the secrecy surrounding the deal itself, but these are important questions that will affect all of us, yet a lot of the detail is hidden from the public, and that just can't be the right way to do these things. Secondly, there's a real risk that important protections that we have in Europe for shoppers, for employees, for the environment could be dragged down to lower American standards if this deal goes through. And thirdly, and I think this is what we were hearing about particularly this week, the ISDS measures within TTIP.
No, you have to explain that.
Well, it's basically a proposal to create a different legal system, different courts, specifically for big corporations.
To decide justice on the agreement. If there are disputes,
it would hand power to
adjudicate
to companies to essentially take a democratically elected government to court if that government enacts a policy which that corporation doesn't like, and
or would be seen to be, in the view of the corporation, in breach of the agreement. Is that what it would? Because corporations can take governments to court now.
But this would create a different legal system through which they could do that. And
the world's biggest corporations don't have the same problem. They have been receiving VIP access from day one and have had abundant influence in the negotiations.
People, the likes of you and I, are excluded. Governments, to a great extent, are excluded. Those who are included are the multinational corporations.
These agreements are basically corporate ownership agreements. The funny thing about free trade agreements, as we understand them, is they often have nothing to do with trade in the sense of the mutual lowering of tariffs. What they're about is enshrining an investor rights regime in the respective countries and ensuring that corporations can run wild in the respective economies with very, very little regulation or impingement by government or authorities.
These treaties will have huge, huge implications for literally almost every critical issue that an individual citizen or community would care about: health, education, the environment, privacy, access to medicines. I mean, the list could go on.
One of the most criticised aspects of TTIP is a system called the Investor State Dispute Settlement, or ISDS. It's a secretive international tribunal that allows companies to sue states over virtually anything that they can claim affects their investment.
If a protest affects their profits, they can sue. If laws affect their profits, they can sue. If new regulations might impact where or what they want to do with their money, they can sue.
This is a new power which will be handed over to US corporations to sue the governments of Europe in a parallel judicial system which is available to them alone. So people have no access to it, domestic firms have no access to it, governments have no access to it. It's just there for foreign investors, in this case, US corporations.
Based on ISDS history, critics argue that European state sovereignty and democracy are at serious risk. Previous lawsuits include Swedish company Vattenfall suing the German state for $3.7 billion for phasing out nuclear energy. British American Tobacco sued Australia for passing a law limiting cigarette advertising. The French company Veolia sued Egypt for raising the minimum wage. TTIP advocates say that in order for the EU and US to become a single market, regulatory barriers need to be eliminated. This way, for example, a US seatbelt manufacturer already selling seatbelts domestically wouldn't need to test for safety a second time, as the EU would agree to recognise the US safety standards. They argue that this would save costs, create jobs, and lower prices for consumers. But just how safe are US standards?
So in the USA, 70% of all processed food sold in supermarkets contains genetically modified ingredients, whereas in the European Union, we've said quite clearly we don't want GM ingredients in our food chain. Similarly, in the US, 90% of all beef is produced using growth hormones, which have been found to be carcinogenic in humans. So they're banned in the European Union. And what the US government is saying is that under TTIP, under the free trade rules that they want to bring in, European consumers don't get the right to choose.
TTIP includes all the most important public sectors in Europe, including education, water, railways, postal services, and most controversially, it also includes public health services.
What is so scary about this is that corporations want to lock in their power. So they not only want increased power, but they want to make it impossible for sovereign governments to reverse the changes which are going to give them power. So, for example, with TTIP, if it passes with ISDS in it, the privatisation of the National Health Service, which is happening in the UK, can never be reversed.
What is democratic about an enormous imposition of power on countries whose citizens have no way of knowing what's going on, of debating it, or influencing their government in its decision? That's anti-democratic.
The history of these agreements shows that they're very difficult to change unless people can see what's in them. And that's why they're kept secret. Because when the contents are revealed, it generates an opposition.
WikiLeaks has had considerable success delaying the TPP and opening up the debate around it and the teaser by releasing the secret draft texts. Our publication of an earlier proposed US-EU agreement, the ACTA, killed it entirely.